into your sourcing approach, finding certainty in the times of flux. We are actually pre-recording this session for the World Sustainable Procurement Day, and we're live here now at the Innovation Forum, as you see the poster behind me. It is the Responsible Sourcing and Ethical Trade Conference, and it's actually an event that's held in its 11th year, and it's for organizations who are passionate about embedding human rights and decent working practices into their supply chain. And they're attended by procurement experts, human rights and responsible sourcing professionals, lawyers, kept to a audience of 200 on purpose in order to allow networking and idea exchange and open conversation. It is governed by the Chatham rules, so whatever is being discussed stays and is completely confidential. And I believe it's one of the first times actually something like that's been happening in the 11th year of the conference. I see the lady from marketing nodding at me. It is very unusual for the Innovation Forum to film live during the event. So this is a first for us and for them, and we're delighted to be here. My name is Victoria Folbeck. I'm joined here by Peter Hood and by my co-chair of the Human Rights chapter of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, my lady in arms, Louise Herring. I am the co-chair as well of the Human Rights chapter of the SPP and also a former Chief Procurement Officer. Now, Peter, I'm going to try and say a bit more about your company. So you're the counsel from King & Spalding, specializing in public international law, ESG, sanctions, business and human rights, with a lot of client base in the US as well as Europe. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
So thank you for being here. And we're actually fresh off a panel. So we're going to reflect on what we heard today at the Innovation Forum. So I'll hand over to you, Louise. What I forgot to mention is that Louise actually is also the executive director of AIM Progress and has her own human rights business called Inherently Human. So you're bringing really the NGO insights and responsible sourcing experience into this conversation. So welcome as well, and I'll hand over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Victoria. So I'm going to take Victoria and Peter back to the panel that you guys have just done. Peter, you did a fantastic job there talking about the legislative landscape on business and human rights and what the state of play is at the moment. Can you talk us through very briefly the state of play, give our procurement colleagues a bit of an overview of where things are, direction of travel, and how are you seeing that impact on the clients that you work with?
Sure. So I mean, there's obviously a lot of uncertainty at the moment. The publication of the omnibus package from the European Commission last month, an uncertainty about the future of the CSDDD and the CSRD, the two marquee pieces of European sustainability legislation. But I think it's important to situate that in its broader geopolitical context and look at what's happening in the US and also what's happening in Europe and in other jurisdictions. And it's clear that there is an overarching trend towards a retreat from sustainability legislation. If we were having this conversation a year ago, it would be very different. The Trump administration is obviously no great friend of sustainability due diligence. I think a lot of that actually comes from an antipathy towards the Green Deal aspects of the sustainability legislation rather than a particular antipathy towards social rights in supply chains. But because of the way that legislation is packaged together, there is a lot of antipathy towards instruments like the CSDDD and CSRD from the US. There is also the US domestic context. Now, at a federal level, there's not very much for them to unpick because there's no federal human rights due diligence legislation, no federal reporting legislation. But nevertheless, I think that the change in administration is very significant in terms of the global landscape for sustainability legislation. Certainly in terms of US companies, there is some significant concern about action by the DOJ or by Republican attorneys general, which might target companies that put a lot into the public domain about their sustainability programs, kind of anti-ESG type lawsuits in the US. But also the US is looking to flex its muscles internationally. So we saw last week the publication of a bill called the Protect USA Act. It's not yet law, has to go through Congress, but that would ban US companies or certain US companies from complying with foreign due diligence legislation. So that can obviously have a chilling effect on multinational companies' willingness to engage in sustainability due diligence. Also, I think it's quite possible that this will become an issue in trade negotiations, tariff negotiations between the US and the EU, certainly with respect to the extraterritorial aspects of the CSDDD and CSRD. So it may be that there is another force coming from the US that looks to suppress some of the sustainability legislation. And that obviously intersects with what's happening in Europe. So there is an indigenous move within Europe, the rise of parties on the centre-right and far-right in the elections last year, and a pushback on some of the sustainability legislation. So I think that broad context and those trends are pretty well known. People know about that. But there are also some really important countercurrents that I think are quite underreported. The first relates to forced labour specifically, and this goes back to what I was saying about how I think the real focus of the antipathy is towards the green aspect. On forced labour, there is the forced labour regulation already in force in Europe. It will start to apply in 2027. There is also US legislation in force under the Tariff Act and the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act, which they don't impose a mandatory obligation to conduct human rights due diligence. But if a product is seized at the border going into the US or into Europe, it will require a company to demonstrate how they have established that there is no forced labour in their supply chain. And the way that they do that is through implementing human rights due diligence, which is in accordance with the UNGPs, the OECD guidelines, which takes account of the ILO indicators on forced labour. So there is still a regulatory imperative to conduct due diligence in relation to forced labour, specifically on the supply chain. And I don't really see that going anywhere. There's no indication from the US or from Europe that that's going to be rolled back. Second countercurrent is that outside of the regulatory sphere, there is still legal risk. So there is legal risk for a company that says that it has in place a due diligence program, fails to implement it, and then that causes a harm to a worker in the supply chain. And there's solid precedent to support a claim which is brought on that basis in English law. So even if the regulation, the CSDDD, the CSRD, were to be scrapped entirely, which I don't think is going to happen, there is still legal jeopardy for a company that has forced labour impacts or broader human rights impacts in its supply chain, which it fails to address properly. And the best way of mitigating that risk is through continuing to apply a due diligence program, implement a due diligence program that aligns with the international standards.
Thank you. Let's take that. I think that's a really helpful overview, really helpful to hear the currents and the countercurrents. Can you touch a little bit on what you're seeing, how your clients are responding to this uncertainty? Our session's talking about a state of flux.
Yeah.
How are companies responding to that? What are you seeing?
So there's a broad range. There are some companies who have bought into the idea that human rights due diligence in the supply chain helps them to build a stronger, more resilient long-term supply chain. And that there is a real value proposition in that, which is completely disconnected from any legal imperative to do that. And so we advise lots of companies who have that philosophy and approach to human rights due diligence. And for them, the changes in regulation are irritating because it changes the way in which they've talked about it internally. It also imposes an additional compliance burden in the short term because lots of these companies were gearing up to release their first CSRD reports this year or next year. They had already decided on their data points. They were collecting the data, and now there's uncertainty about what exactly they're going to have to report. But there's no real effect on the underlying commitment to conduct human rights due diligence in the supply chain. So that reflects, some of the clients that we advise. But then there are also other clients who come at it more from a compliance perspective and who see the CSRD, CSDDD as imposing a compliance burden. That's particularly the case, I think, amongst non-EU companies who are going to be affected by the extraterritorial aspects of the EU legislation. And for those companies, actually the questions that we're getting are more focused on, well, is this legislation going to survive? Do we need to comply? And if we don't, what are the consequences? Can it be enforced? And so we weren't really having those conversations a year ago, and now those questions are being asked. So I think it would be incorrect to say that every company has the same approach and they're all fully committed to human rights due diligence in the supply chain. Some do. Those who see it as a compliance burden are seeing the opportunities in the regulatory uncertainty.
Great, thank you. And we'll come back a little bit more to the mood in the room at the Innovation Forum and what we're hearing from companies here on that point. So, yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about the changes in the legislation, maybe more from a procurement angle? I mean, it might just be picking up a couple of the points that you said, but what should matter most to procurement professionals about the flux in legislation? It's not changes, as you pointed out, it hasn't come through yet, but what should they be focusing on at this point?
Yeah, so obviously there's a short-term imperative to ensure that the company is set up to comply with the legislation. And there is real uncertainty in that respect. It's difficult to know exactly what a company is going to need to report on and when. And so companies need to stay alive to the regulatory changes that are happening in the EU. But when it comes to the fundamentals of the human rights due diligence programs, I mean, I think that it is good advice to say, well, there are a number of different pieces of legislation. There are a number of different sources of legal risk. There are a number of different sources of commercial risk and reputational risk. And the best way of mitigating all of those different forms of risk is to stay the course and to continue to implement a human rights due diligence program in the supply chain, which is attuned to the UNGPs. The UNGPs ultimately underpin all of this legislation and the approach to due diligence in all of this legislation. Now, there are some variations in how it's framed, there's some divergences, but at its core, a company that implements human rights due diligence on its supply chain in accordance with the UNGPs is going to be a company which is well placed to meet various different reporting requirements, various different due diligence requirements, and well placed to ensure that its products don't get blocked on entry into the US or into the EU on the basis that there's a suspicion of forced labour. So there's I think a blend between the short-term requirement to understand how the legislation is changing and also an ability to take a step back and understand what underpins all of this legislation and where it's likely to go, 5, 10, 20 years from now, because it takes a long time to put these programs into place.
Yeah.
But I think if I may interject, what does it mean for procurement? I'm sitting here with my own chief procurement hat on. And for me, there are two main areas of activity that I'd advise procurement people. One of them is get yourself some good lawyers to workshop what that actually means. But also, you cannot become, as a procurement person, I think I echo that when I speak to a lot of sentiment that I hear from a lot of procurement professionals. We're not experts in regulation, and neither should we be. We need to have our sustainability people, the NGOs that help us to make sense of it, the lawyers, to actually distill the essence of the law, of the regulation, etc. But so first thing is surround yourself with people who can explain what is happening, because you cannot do it yourself. The other side of it is that's like an external activity. The internal activity, you have category strategies, you have country purchasing strategies. Intrinsic, whether the regulation changes or not, you have risks. And actually, a lot of the companies here also reflect that sometimes when The Guardian, the BBC, or any other big, the Washington Post, any other big newspaper talks about forced labor, talks about this thing, it plummets the company. So there are things that you have to do. There are risks in your supply chain. If you're a logistics supplier, if you're a facilities management supplier, they're there, they're not going away, and you have to make sure that you understand what the risks are in your category and you work to eliminate them however possible. So at the end, fundamentally, I think all this noise could detract you from your work, but your work is not changing. There are issues and you need to know them and you need to overcome them. So I guess from my procurement perspective, this is what I'm seeing. Do you want to pivot on how you're finding the Innovation Forum and how the 1.5 days have been for you?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think we were going to reflect a little bit on what's, building on what you've just said, Peter, what's the mood in the room? I mean, I think, I don't want to repeat what you've said. I think a lot of the things that you've said, we've heard loud and clear from the various panels, that this going back to the UNGPs, looking at, the steps within the UNGPs of identify, assess, manage, remedy, that is where everyone is going back to. And I think what's been really encouraging is the kind of the optimism, the refocusing on that. As you've said, lots of people talking about this needs to be business as usual. It is business as usual, and we're going to go back to that. I think the other thing that maybe I'll just touch on that's really resonated with me is there are really valuable, deep conversations at the Innovation Forum, particularly in the working sessions. And often what they come down to is companies really having taken a risk-based approach, also a rights-based approach, but a risk-based approach to their due diligence. So they're using that premise of the UNGPs to really understand where their highest risks are, and then focusing their resources on that, which is the efficient, effective, with a procurement hat on, that's the most efficient, effective thing to do. And that's where the real learnings come from, is people that are focusing on child labour or labour providers as a point of kind of high risk. And that's where you get the really interesting case studies and learning and sharing, which is really interesting. So I've definitely heard a kind of real mood of kind of optimism. I guess the other, I'll touch on this briefly and then want to hear your reflections. We were just talking a little bit earlier about AI. I think that's also really interesting, particularly for, and you can give your perspective, Victoria, but I think, often what procurement colleagues want is data and information about suppliers that they can act on. They're interested in the transparency of supply chains, in traceability about risks, but then also fundamentally a lot of what they're trying to do is to manage risk, engage with suppliers. And there was a great session yesterday about what AI is going to add to that, how AI tools are going to be used, which I think is a real, when we come to sort of things to watch out for the next 12 months, I think that's going to be a really interesting one. How about you, Victoria? How have you found the sessions from a procurement professional perspective? What's really resonated with you about the last couple of days?
I think what resonated with me is that there's much more procurement professionals in the room taking ownership of the problem. And I also see it in this World Sustainable Procurement Day, because when we started off our chapter last year and we launched at the World Sustainable Procurement Day last year, I think there were only a handful of sessions really tackling decent worker practices and human rights, elimination of modern slavery. Whereas now we have quite a lot of sessions throughout the 25 hours talking about that. So I think that procurement realizes that this is something that actually they need to own, and also that they are openly starting to talk about the fact that they don't have all the answers, that they're much more comfortable within the E of the ESG, but they want to understand how to address the social impact, and they're reaching out to people within their organizations to collaborate to actually progress this topic, but also talked about the fact that in some cases we're going back to business cases, we're going back to ROI, we're going back to, it's not just done because it's a good thing. In some countries or jurisdictions, we need to now show the bottom dollar positive impact of doing any program within your supply chain. So this is another kind of interesting snippet that we're hearing and that we hopefully can tackle. But yeah, so how are you seeing that?
Well, I wanted to come back to you, if you don't mind, Victoria, with another question, because I guess I've been working in this space for 20 years, and as a responsible sourcing person, for a long, long time, we've been saying we need procurement and responsible sourcing people to work more closely together. We need human rights to be embedded within what procurement teams do. So if you don't mind, I wanted to ask you, do you think we are now seeing that? I know you've talked about more engagement through World Sustainable Procurement Day, but trying to pinpoint, and I've got a couple of examples, and I will add in as well, but practical things you've heard from the last couple of days about, are we seeing that trend of much closer working moving forward? What do you think?
Yeah. I think we are seeing that, and I actually want to ask you to give your examples, because you have been interviewing and had the panel with Schneider Electric, and there are a lot of real pragmatic, practical takeaways to structure yourself for success. But we are seeing a much bigger collaboration, I think, through the discussions we have here of cross-functional teams and of sustainability working with procurement, but also what I'm hearing, which I love to hear from our last panel with Maersk and with Avon, is that they are embedding themselves into procurement, that they're not a siloed team, and that they're sitting there as non-procurement professionals, sustainability professionals, trying to understand how procurement works and actually embedding their work into procurement day-to-day processes. So this is a great help, of course, and rather than battling each other, we are now starting to see that people are, leaning in and reaching out. So that's brilliant and encouraging to see. Yeah. But what about your reflection?
I think the things that I'd heard, which I felt were really positive. So various different companies talking about KPIs being integrated into procurement teams' performance objectives, but also bonuses. And I think that's because often the question that comes up is, how do you really encourage a procurement person to put an equal value on sustainability, including human rights, alongside price and kind of quality and other elements? So I think that was really interesting to see people actually doing that, to see companies actually doing that rather than just talking about it. There was a really interesting point that's been picked up a couple of times about when you're doing your supplier reviews, actually having sustainability and human rights on the agenda for those annual review or KPI meetings and having it first on the agenda. I think that was perhaps sort of the change. We've been seeing companies start to do that, but the example that was given of that's the first thing that you sit down and talk to someone about, because that's very, very clear signalling that this is really important and this matters. So I think that was really good. So we've had KPIs, we've had bonuses. I think just a really great example that was given from your panel of thinking about how do you build human rights into every stage of the procurement cycle. And that's something that, you and I have talked about, quite a lot and really trying to focus in on with the SPP human rights chapter is, just very simple steps. The way it was explained was very simple. I suspect for the company that had done it, it's probably not that straightforward, but just thinking, whether you're at the contracting stage, whether you're, whatever cycle it is, whether you're managing, whether you're doing RFPs, actually kind of building, human rights questions in at that point. And I think just, the quote from your session that I took away was human rights is part of procurement, just having that as a fundamental basis. We're seeing a lot more teams, I think, being integrated as well. So I think that's been a change perhaps that I've really noticed, say in the last sort of 5 years, is that human rights people are now sat in procurement teams. There aren't these kind of two separate teams. And I think that kind of seems really crucial. And
you're right, because a lot of, last year when I was at this forum, I picked up a lot of tension between sustainable procurement teams that even might sit within procurement, but they seem to have been having a completely different agenda with regards to suppliers and procurement as the category managers, the guys who are negotiating the deals. And then we had the anecdotal evidence of suppliers being confused because on one hand you want the cheapest price, on the other hand the sister team, responsible sourcing sister team, is coming to you and saying, yeah, but I also want you to invest in worker wellness programs and upskilling. And you're like, well, what do you want? Do you want the cheapest price? Or do you want, us be on the sustainability journey with you? And now I'm hearing less of that tension, which is certainly great. It's a positive step.
Yeah. I don't think we've answered. I think there are still a lot of challenges remaining. And I guess there's a fundamental challenge in the sort of black and white nature of procurement versus the very grey nature of human rights. I think that's a challenge that we continue to come against. But I wondered whether maybe we'd sort of move to kind of finish this by thinking about what will the next 12 months hold. I don't know, Peter, if you could sort of touch on that. If you're a procurement professional, what do you have any sort of practical recommendations for businesses and for procurement people? We'll make it broader to be fair to you, but what do they need to be thinking about over the next 12 months? Any new hot topics you see kind of flying in? Or, is it just more trying to get to grips with the kind of current uncertainty? What would you say?
So I think if we're talking about the next 12 months, one issue is grappling with the uncertainty that affects the regulatory landscape. I think a really powerful message coming out of the forum is that there are multiple drivers to conduct human rights due diligence on your supply chain. Only one of those is a regulatory driver, but it is still necessarily an important driver. and a company still needs to comply with the regulation. So over the next 12 months, there is an imperative to kind of respond to that uncertainty, to navigate it, to stay on top of what's happening in the EU, particularly in relation to the omnibus and what that means for the CSRD, reporting under the CSRD. But then that needs to be balanced with a longer term perspective and a sense of, well, if this is something that really drives value in the business, those changes might have a short term effect, but they don't necessarily change our approach to dealing with human rights in the supply chain. And so having the ability to speak to the company about that and to make a value proposition for human rights due diligence, which is based not just on regulation, but based on the broader value. And then I suppose the other point is that the CSDDD and the CSRD, they're not the only two pieces of legislation, and they're not the only two sources of legal risk. So if it is a company where actually it's really powerful to make the argument to say, well, and there is legal risk if we don't do this, there is still legal risk, irrespective of what happens to the CSRD and CSDDD. And that risk, as I see it, is primarily focused on forced labour issues in the supply chain, which will, for very, very many companies, be a salient human rights issue. And so if you have an approach which is based in the UNGPs and conducting a salience assessment based on the severity of the risk, then that's aligned with an approach which looks to minimize legal risk, because it minimizes the risk of getting products blocked when you're trying to import them into the EU or the US, and it minimizes the risk of civil claims being brought by victims of supply chain forced labor. So in that respect, there's I think a really important role for procurement and legal to play in balancing what do we do with the short-term uncertainty and how does this play out in terms of our longer-term legal and procurement strategy.
Right, thank you. Victoria, what are your thoughts for the next 12 months that you think we need to focus on?
Building on what Peter said, I think what we also heard in the room today is that there was a certain over-reliance on the EU regulation, and that became like the reason for doing things is to comply, not because we're doing the right thing, but because we need to comply. So people are stepping back and saying, well, what is the business case? And we in procurement, we love a good business case. And this is what we're trying to do. And I think getting a little bit stricter with ourselves and saying, okay, what is the ROI? What is the business case? Broadening the story so that everybody can understand what you're doing is the right thing for the company. It could be it could, improve productivity, improve quality. It has so many different positive aspects, ultimately differentiating the company, give the company better profitability, such as IKEA, Patagonia, and so many other companies. They made it their core, and as a result, it is driving them, and consumers recognize them, they buy into the story of I'm buying something ethical here on every single level. So I think ROI is really important. I think also what I heard yesterday is pilot things. The board might not just throw money at things. We are in maybe perhaps another recession, perhaps we have other cost challenges. So people are not just going to fall over and say it's a good idea to do these things. You need to prioritize, you need to pilot them, you need to be very careful, and thus collaborate with your internal stakeholders to choose the right kind of program in your supply chain to go through. And also then collaborate with your supplier partners. So find the suppliers that are actually critical for you, that share your own values, and do these short pilots with them to gain confidence, to grow, and then to create a playbook to, scale this. So collaboration, ROI are critical. What do you think?
So, I think that the ROI one, I think, is it's a great point to end with, because I think it's something that we've all got to really focus on, is how do we start to really understand the impact of our work on human rights and make everyone within a kind of business understand that impact and be able to measure that impact and talk about how it changes things for the business, how it builds resilience for the business, but also how it helps workers and farmers, which is ultimately the point of the human rights work. I think, I had sort of three kind of reflections. First of all, thank you for the conversation. Thank you, Peter, for your time. Victoria and I, as you know, are really passionate about this piece of the intersection of procurement and human rights, but it's really fantastic to get your perspective. I think I'm really encouraged by the fact that we're having such a more connected conversation. I think it's been brilliant to get different perspectives, to get the legal, the procurement, and share the responsible sourcing perspective. I'm really encouraged by the fact that the messages I think we've heard from the forum is, as we said, that human rights is really part of procurement, and increasingly so. I think that's brilliant. I was going to, there was a quote from your, I think it was from one of the sessions earlier today, from a procurement person about commitment. We all need to stay committed to this topic of human rights, which I think you've really made the kind of case for why that still needs to happen, even with the uncertainty. Someone talked about commitment, persistence, and agility. Those are the three things that procurement people need to have. And I think that's really come out from our conversation about how we really embed human rights within procurement, how we think about the different stages of the procurement cycle, but how we also need to stay agile because the kind of risks are changing. So that's, definitely something that I've taken away. I guess we would really emphasise to people that are listening to this webinar, please do try and take some of these insights back to your teams. Please continue the conversations internally. It's really important to work out how different functions within the business can work together and what role procurement wants to take. Please share some of the best practices. If every company listening today could build in human rights and sustainability as point one of their supplier reviews, I think that would be a brilliant kind of takeaway for everyone to take on. Thank you to those of you that have listened. We are going to be staying on for a Q&A session. So when this recording finishes, Peter, myself and Victoria will be online to answer your questions, whether that's about the legislation, whether that's about the role of procurement, or whether that's about bringing responsible sourcing and procurement together. Thank you so much, Victoria and Peter, for your time. Thank you to the Innovation Forum for facilitating this conversation and for allowing us to do this recording at the great event. Thank you both.
Thanks.
Great. So hello, everyone. Hopefully, Victoria, Peter, you can hear me all right?
Yeah, wonderful.
Perfect.
Oh,
okay,
there we go.
We're live. Cats joining the session. Really lovely to have people online. Hope you enjoyed the pre-recorded session that we did earlier. We've got about 17 minutes to answer questions. So please do put them into the Q&A. We've got a couple to get us going, but please do put them into the Q&A function in AirMeet, and we will come to them. Just wanted to highlight that in the chat function, there are quite a few interesting resources going in there, particularly on the point around ROI, which Victoria and I finished on during the recording. Slightly unfortunately, in terms of the complex agenda, the next session after our pre-recorded session was then on a really great case study that looked at the integration of climate change and human rights and the return on investment that there was for the business that had done that work on heat stress. So I just put that into the chat because we didn't talk about it in the pre-recording because it hadn't happened yet. So I just wanted to put that in. And if people have got other examples you've got that address this question of how do we really make the case and look at ROI around investment in human rights, I think that would be really, really good to look at. Peter, I don't know if the first question on there, and it's a really nice challenging one, but I don't know whether you'd be happy to answer that. So Eskil does ask a question about car emissions legislation driving fuel efficiency, and why we're not seeing the same kind of human rights legislation driving safe workplaces in the EU. Why is the same direction not being taken? So I think sort of where this question is coming from is, the legislation that's out there is either tariff import based, like the EU forced labour that you just described, or it's due diligence based. It's not necessarily looking at impacts of legislation or asking for very, very specific things like safe workplaces. But perhaps you would argue that the health and safety legislation is already there. What's your perspective?
Yeah, so I suppose that there's a few ways to think about this question. The first is, can the legislation drive improved human rights standards relating to safe workplaces and other human rights issues? And I think, in principle, the answer to that is yes. And everyone on this panel has seen examples of where human rights due diligence has resulted in better working conditions in companies' operations or in its supply chain. So I think that there is a fair basis to assume that the more companies that are required to do that, the more it will drive an improvement in working conditions in global supply chains. Now, that can be challenged and that can be tested. Like if a company's being compelled to do something, are they going to do it as well as they would in the kind of case studies that I was referring to of a company that really invested in it because they want to drive that type of change as opposed to being forced to do so by a regulatory requirement. But in principle, I mean, my view is that yes, it can drive that type of change. There's another angle to the question, which is, well, what's stopping that progress? And that's more of a political question, I suppose. And it's the belief by some businesses and some pro-business political parties in the member states and also in the European Parliament that this is just about adding red tape and regulatory burden, and that it doesn't actually have any impact, and that the priority should be incentivizing and encouraging growth. And I suppose on that point, there is a real role, an important role for companies that have bought in and who see the ROI on conducting human rights due diligence to engage with the broader business community and to engage in the political debate to challenge that assumption, because it is often, I think, an assumption which is not based in the reality of the experience of companies that have implemented it at a large scale. It's often based in an assumption, well, this looks like something new that we have to do. We haven't been doing it before. It's going to cost us money to set it up. Why do we have to do this? And so there's a real role for companies that have played a leading role in developing, precedent examples of human rights due diligence that really works to engage in that debate and to try and chip away at some of those political blocks or roadblocks. On the question specifically, Louise, that you put about health and safety legislation, obviously there is a lot of health and safety legislation already in place, both at an EU level, but also at a domestic level, which governs conditions in workplaces in those jurisdictions. And I mean, if you look at the history of that legislation over the last 100 years, it's yielded incredible changes and advancements in the number of serious injuries and fatalities in the workplace, particularly if you look in the UK context. Before that legislation was introduced, workplace fatalities were commonplace and the statistics were horrific, and now they're not, and in large part that is a result of over time an increasingly rigorous health and safety legislative regime. Now, the obvious flaw in that point is that it's purely domestic. It doesn't extend nationally. It doesn't impose an obligation on a company's supply chain. That's the novelty of the human rights due diligence legislation, is that it pushes it beyond the domestic into the international supply chain. And so that's the opportunity for the human rights due diligence legislation, and that's why it's important for those people in the procurement community and the legal community that believe that this can deliver that type of change throughout supply chains to be vocal about it and to explain that.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. I can't see any other questions just yet, but please do post a question. I was going to. Is there another question somewhere?
There is another question from Eskil, a difficult one. Before I actually am happy to take that question. Before I do, though, I just wanted to sensitize people to the resources tab, and Peter was kind enough to share a couple of insights from King & Spalding on the omnibus regulation, or the regulation that's about to hit the US. So when I was saying that we shouldn't and can't be experts as procurement on regulations, I meant it, but I also love these takeaways, succinct takeaways that lawyers produce that we can actually read quickly and digest and understand what on earth is happening there. So thank you, Peter, for giving us these resources to read and use. On Eskil's question, he is saying IKEA disregard biodiversity. How should that be considered when we measure sustainable corporations? And attached a article about IKEA being blamed for Romanian forest destruction. Well, a couple of things here. How I would like to pivot the question. we're not here to, well, firstly, we're human rights, biodiversity is linked, but this is not something we're anchoring in. Having said that, whatever tragedy happens, we need to acknowledge, and it's awful. We also actually need to sit back whenever we see what's written and reflect on actually what's happening, why it's happening. A lot of these top-line news articles require us to really assess and reflect what's in the background and the totality and complexity of how it's reported. What I'm trying to say is we're not here to pass judgment on what's right and what's wrong. What I can reflect on and what I heard from talking to a lot of NGOs who are helping procurement understand the topic, and also procurement itself, is that this is not a problem. Like, let's pivot back to human rights and problems that are happening with very well established organizations. Yeah, this is not a problem where you can tick a box, do your due diligence, say that everything is right, and then move on to another problem. We've heard over and over again that in the construction and FM industry, for example, here in the UK, that criminal gangs actually infiltrate recruitment agencies, they infiltrate big corporations because they're big, because they have a name, and actually to commit their human rights, modern slavery, forced labor violations. And they do that time and time again. It's live, it's open, it's happening in the UK. So these things have to be constantly watched. It's a multifaceted, really complex area. And I guess my takeaway from this is newspapers hold our hands and feet to the fire. My always rule is you have to read beyond the title to really understand what's happening. The best person who can answer this, Eskil, is going to be IKEA, not us. But we know from working inside that kind of area that even if you set your structures up correctly, things do fall through the cracks. So it's not about necessarily blaming. It's about how is a company that finds a fault actually what is the company doing about it, and how is it strengthening its advocacy, its structures, its protocols, conversations, how it mitigates the risks that happen, because risks will happen. So I don't know whether, Louise, you want to reflect on this, because obviously you have 25 years in this area.
Well, I was going to do a very quick reflection, and then I was going to ask Peter a question about this, because I think there is a really interesting point your point is more broadly interesting, Eskil, but there's an interesting point there about who gets in the headlines, which companies get in the headlines. And the question I'm going to ask Peter, just so you can mentally prepare, is who is the target of litigation and, the court cases in this area. One of the interesting things I was reflecting on that your question made me think about, Eskil, was the question of engaging stakeholders. So part of the growth I think we see in this area is that really to do good work on human rights, you've got to be speaking to a much broader group of people than we have been doing historically. So historically, the relationship was the customer, the brand, the retailer made requirements of their supplier, the supplier responded. There was a lot of a power dynamic within that, a kind of one-way traffic. We've seen that change a lot over the last kind of 5-10 years. And I think procurement have been central to that, of making much more a two-way conversation, giving suppliers ownership of this topic, which has been fantastic. But ultimately, if what we're trying to do through this work is protect workers and farmers and communities, that the engagement with stakeholders, which is the jargon that we use in the world of human rights due diligence, has to go much more broader. It has to mean two-way conversations with workers and with communities and farmers. And one of the things that came up in the Innovation Forum, which I thought was really interesting, is we haven't done a great job of that historically. There's a lot more work being done, particularly by the bigger multinational companies, to bring community voices in, to develop due diligence programs with those people around the table, so you actually know that the work that you're doing is addressing risks that matter. The heat stress example is a really, really good one, where the work they're doing there was really basic. It was basically like, make sure that workers don't have to walk 7 kilometers to go to the toilet because they're in a field, make sure they've got water. But a lot of those things have been missed. They've been missed by farm owners and big businesses because they weren't talking to workers. So I think that's a very basic example. But where I'm linking it back to the biodiversity point is nature can't speak. And I think that's a real challenge, is that as a stakeholder, we've got to put them into the due diligence picture in a way that, you know, is quite hard to do because they don't have a voice, and we haven't done it very well for people that have got a voice, even harder for nature. So that was really my reflection. But Peter, I don't know if you could sort of touch on, because it was one of the questions I had from your last response is, you know, do you think litigation is a good thing? I don't know if that's a fair thing to ask a lawyer, but litigation on human rights, you talked about how in health and safety it has driven change. And I think, you know, you see a lot of headlines about companies having to pay fines. One always hopes that it drives better behaviour, reduces the number of accidents and deaths. You know, I guess from what you said, you know, you feel like the stats are there. But, you know, I think you talked about on the panel, you said, I think we might see more human rights litigation happening. Do you think it ends up being targeted at the right companies? Is it targeted at those that, you know, like the example we've given, that are more likely to make headlines? Do you think it will drive companies to do the right thing in the next,
really
however many years?
Critical question. I think the first point is to distinguish between regulation and litigation. And the point I'm making about health and safety is primarily focused on regulation. And I think the answer to that's pretty clear. I think regulation does drive change as long as it's properly enforced. You can compare jurisdictions in which there is a strong regulatory regime and which there is a weak regulatory regime. The jurisdiction in which there is a strong regulatory regime will have fewer worker deaths and fewer serious injuries in the workplace. So I don't think that's particularly controversial. The much more controversial question relates to litigation. And so really there, what I mean is claims that are brought by affected rights holders, whether that's in operations, subsidiaries, or in the supply chain. Now, these claims have been being brought in the UK for a number of years. The UK is one of the jurisdictions because of rules on litigation funding in particular, but also the rules of the courts on jurisdiction over impacts that occur overseas, which is relatively receptive to this type of claim. It's not easy at all for that type of claim to be brought. There are lots of challenges, but compared to some other jurisdictions, it's relatively easy to bring those claims. So it's the English courts have seen a number of the key landmark cases in this area. So I talk about the English cases not just because I'm being parochial, but because I think it is reflective of how these claims are brought and how the cases have been brought internationally. Under English law, there is no duty to conduct human rights due diligence, and there is no duty to report on human rights due diligence other than the limited reporting obligation under the Modern Slavery Act. And a company that does and says nothing is in a position where it doesn't establish a duty under common law, whereas a company that implements a human rights due diligence program, talks about it, puts it in its public sustainability reports, is a company that voluntarily assumes a legal duty, which can be the basis for a legal action. So there is I think historically a dysfunction in the English legal system, which is that a company that does nothing can in some ways avoid one of the bases on which a claim can be brought in private law, whereas a company that does more and is willing to talk openly about the challenges that they face in their supply chain, their operations, puts into the public domain material that can be used to found a claim. And I think it's not universally true, but a lot of the key cases that were brought over the last 10 years in England were brought against that type of company. And they, in my view, are not necessarily the worst offenders. The worst offenders are the companies that say and do nothing. So one of the opportunities introduced by mandatory human rights due diligence legislation was that it would create a more level playing field, and all companies would be required to do something, would be required to report. And that could have the effect of refocusing the attention of this litigation on those companies that are doing nothing. But in the absence of that legal duty, I think we still have that kind of policy dysfunction where there is in some way, there is a risk, a legal risk associated with saying and doing more. Now, I think you could be quite reductive in the conclusion that you draw from that and say, well, the safest legal course of action is to do nothing. I don't think that is the case, because like generally the way in which claims are framed is that if there is an adverse impact, then claimant lawyers will find a way to bring the claim and kind of adapt the law creatively to do so. And so the best way of avoiding litigation is to avoid the impact in the first place. I think you do that by knowing your operations and your supply chain, knowing where the risks are and mitigating them. And so if you take a more holistic view of risk, legal risk and commercial reputational risk, as well as ethical imperatives, then I don't think that is the right course of action. But that is a conclusion that some companies have drawn from some of those cases, which I think is a problem.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. I know that we're out of time. I'm going to really cheekily just, sorry, Victoria, see whether we can get a 1 minute answer, Peter, to the question about
another answer, Peter.
Yes, Deirdre said it's fine.
Yeah,
we're all right. How to frame this? Can ESG targets be incorporated into purchasing contracts as a way to drive sustainability commitments? And I'm sure the person that answered this question was thinking about two-way targets that put requirements on suppliers, but also on the customers. Do you ever see that happening, Peter?
Yes, we're actually currently drafting a suite of contracts that have reciprocal obligations for buyer and purchaser. And there are some companies that are willing to do it, but they are relatively few. And still the approach in procurement contracts that we see most often is an approach which looks to just push down all of the obligations onto the supplier. And I think we know that that doesn't work. If you're looking at this from the perspective of what drives change in the supply chain, there has to be a recognition of the fact that purchasers play a significant role and have to be contractually obligated to engage in responsible business conduct. So I think that the target specifically is about the question specifically is about ESG targets. I mean, I think that can be relevant, but I think much more important are contractual provisions that require engagement in a process and engagement with stakeholders. I think those contractual provisions can drive the type of change that yields results for rights holders in the supply chain. Whereas if it's something that's focused very much just on targets, then it becomes more of a box ticking exercise. It's easier to manipulate, and we've all seen examples of that being done.
Brilliant, great. Thank you so much indeed. Thank you everyone that's joined us. We have to wrap up now so that we can move on to the next session. Victoria, anything you'd like to say to people? The resources are on there. I think we sorted that out during the session, so you should be able to access the resources that have come from King & Spalding as well as some from In Progress. Please do join the SPP Human Rights chapter if you haven't already. We've got some great events planned for the rest of the year. We'd love to get you involved actively or coming along to those sessions. Please do get in touch via LinkedIn if you'd like to do that. Big thank you to Victoria and Peter and to the organisers of today. Anything else you'd like to say, Victoria?
I think we've done really great, Peter. Awesome to have you on board. As we said yesterday, we hope to hear more of you. You're going to be our institute law person to help us out with all these difficult questions. It was great to have you with us unpicking it all, and I hope that we make the world a better place 2025, right?
Right. That's a good goal. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
We are SPP, the Sustainable Procurement Pledge.
Global community committed to a single grand goal.
To make sustainable procurement the default.
We think multi-generationally.
We make decisions that guide trillions of dollars.
We believe that sustainable sourcing practices are the fastest way for us to save the world.
This is a call to the unsung heroes.
You, the procurement professionals,
and your allies.
United we are changing tomorrow.
For people and planet. Together, we procure the future.
Sign the pledge.
Activate your power.
Join a community that gets it done.
Procure tomorrow.